All right, ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to talk about food chains and food webs. Firstly, let's think about ecology. Ecology is about the relationships between organisms, living things, their environments, and other living things. Important relationships here between these things are, of course, feeding relationships. Who likes to eat who? And, of course, energy flow, which are very closely linked because we get energy from what we eat most of the time, particularly if we're a consumer. Last time we talked about consumers and producers and a few other different types of classification of organisms. Remember, consumer eats other organisms. A producer makes its own food, often from the sun through photosynthesis. So let's have a look at a basic sort of a food chain. So, here's the sun. There he is. The sun provides energy for grass. Grass gets eaten by grasshoppers. Grasshoppers get eaten by frogs. Frogs get eaten by owls. Owls get eaten by cats. Very, very basic food chain. Grass is the producer. The rest of the organisms are consumers in this case. The grasshopper, the frog, the owl, and the cat. We can, of course, represent this in a slightly different way. For those who don't like to draw or use Play School Art Maker, we can just write out the names of the things. So, grass gets eaten by the grasshopper, which gets eaten by a frog, which gets eaten by an owl, which gets eaten by a cat. Notice the direction of the arrows. They go towards the thing that eats. So grass gets eaten by the grasshopper, gets eaten by the frog, gets eaten by the owl, gets eaten by the cat. They point in the direction of the energy flow. So they point in the direction of the energy flow. Now, let's have another think about this. Right, grass is our producer. It's not like Mel Brooks, but a producer nonetheless. He makes his own food through photosynthesis from the sun, gets his energy from the sun. He passes that energy on to the grasshopper. The grasshopper is what we call, in this food chain, a first order consumer. The frog's a consumer as well. Guess what order consumer the frog is in this case? Oh yes, I knew you'd know. Second order consumer. Third order for the owl. Fourth order for the cat. In this food chain, the cat is at the top of the food chain. It's the fourth order consumer here. And the energy from the grass eventually gets to the cat. So we're talking about energy flowing from originally the sun, of course, to the grass, up to the cat. Now have a think about this. The grass gets the energy from the sun, makes its own food. The grasshopper then thinks, delicious lunch. And it eats the grass. But it has to run away or hop away from the frogs. It has to find home. It has to find mates. It has to reproduce. All of that uses energy. so we lose some energy as heat. The frog, similar thing, has to jump after the grasshoppers, has to hide from the owls, has to swim around, getting other different types of food, of course, other than grasshoppers, but it uses some energy and loses it as heat. The owl, same thing. So each way along, we're losing energy out of this ecosystem and this relationship. Now, food chains obviously don't represent all of the relationships in an ecosystem. They're a very simplified version. In order to show more of the relationships, we can use something called a food web. And a food web is basically lots of food chains put together. Let's have a bit of a look at an example of an underwater food web. Isn't this pretty? So, things like phytoplankton get eaten by zooplankton. Zooplankton get eaten by krill. Now, krill get eaten by small fish, also get eaten by medium-sized fish. This little small fish over here can have some. The small fish gets eaten by the bigger fish. The bigger fish can also eat this guy. Oh, did I do that wrong? Yes, I did. Because the bigger fish eats him. The bigger fish will also eat him. He can eat the smaller fish too. The bigger fish will eat the crab if he wants. The crab can eat the shellfish. The little fish can eat the seaweed as well as the krill, and probably also eats the zooplankton. As you can see, it starts getting quite complicated. And, let's be honest, living things and their interactions are quite complicated. Okay? However, we can represent things in this food web. And we can look at what happens if we take one of the things out of the food web. We can look at which other species are affected the most, whether their populations will increase or decrease, and think about the effects that flow on from changing or altering the population of one of the species. This is obviously just an example, but you'll be able to find many other examples on the web if you have a quick look. To finish, I just want to quickly talk about biomass pyramids. Now, when I'm talking about a biomass pyramid, we can think of the idea that I talked about before, and that is that at every level of a food chain, or every what we call trophic level, we lose some energy. And because we're losing energy, we can support less and less organisms as we move up the food chain. So as we move up those trophic levels, we can support less and less organisms because there's less energy to go around. So if we think about something like grass being the producer, there's going to be lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of grass. Now, if our first order consumer is our little grasshoppers, there he is, little antenna, our little grasshoppers, well, there are going to be a few grasshoppers, quite a number, but not as many grasshoppers as there is grass. And when we're talking about not as many grasshoppers as there is grass, I'm saying there's not as much mass of grasshoppers as there is mass of grass. That's why we're talking biomass. Now, if we move on from grasshoppers, let's go to, say, I'll use a different example, snakes. There's going to be less snakes than there are grasshoppers because there's not as much energy. And then what can eat snakes? Well, maybe our good old friend, the kookaburra. There's going to be less kookaburras than there are snakes because there's a loss of energy at each of these levels. That is a brief overview of food chains and webs and energy in ecosystems.